Hello everyone, today we talk about German and Flemish warfare during the High Middle Ages, roughly the mid-11th, the mid-14th century, something actually a bit later than the High Middle Ages per se. But as you know, I began this series last year about general warfare of the regions that eventually, as you know, I discuss in much more thorough detail, talking about the tactics, army organization, arms and armor, battles, of course, and more, that have this timeline that I thought is interesting, because from one side, it basically starts in the moment of affirmation. Speaking of Western warfare, what we see as heavy cavalry dominating the battlefields, which would take a while, actually, a century from the beginning, and let's say also observing the tale, we can say, of medieval warfare civilization before the great crisis of the 14th century, actually already in that dimming of the earlier warfare. So in many ways it's a lot about feudal warfare, but this is a series that includes practically all Eurasia and the Mediterranean. So it's going to be pretty interesting to observe all the series. I made already one about Georgian warfare, about Leonese and Castilian warfare, and then, as I said before, we will fill the gaps with all the other more in-depth videos. And we talked about German warfare often for medieval history, observing the characters also of this land in other videos about more like the political and social situation of the land. Today we talk about the German Kingdom of Germany, originally the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, therefore including also other territories that are not properly the one of what we call Germany per se. So speaking of the empire, we will make 4 different videos about this. One would be this, then another about Bohemia and Moravia that have their own peculiar warfare. Then the Kingdom of Burgundy slash Arles, that is also kind of overlooked. Then the Kingdom of Italy, probably including the patrimony of St. Peter, because basically central and northern Italian warfare were homogeneous, and observing how within the same enormous territory that was the Holy Roman Empire, there would be some of the most complicated, also rapidly changing political, social, and consequently military systems, the plurality of which should be stressed because it's often misleadingly overlooked as just the broader Germanic Empire, but actually having all these different countries, nations with their specific military characteristics that really reveal a lot, also in the same interwar, right? Especially for what Germany and Italy are concerned, we're looking at some probably single most interesting military systems in medieval Europe. Also, probably the areas with the highest, surely for Italy, Germany went pretty close to that as well, the highest level of belligerence in medieval Europe, easily. This is being recognized already by Contamine, by other authors, Verbruggen, and that is connected to exactly this continuous and, albeit complex and complicated, but still some consistent political institutional development on bases that were substantially different from the idea of a national monarchy as we see in England or France, that however would contribute to the say to the same maintenance of the order through the same military, the same violence in many ways. And this is especially the case of Germany, that witnessed at this point the collapse of its national monarchic attempt It was very complicated since the beginning, and that witnessed an idea, properly a proclivity in the use of violence that was very different from other countries, especially in Western Europe. In fact, one of the most important things to stress today that is properly not done is that there's not just like a Western or Eastern military, let's say, or simply culture, as video games somewhat show. We have, as properly as Westerns, to be aware properly of the existence of a Central European world separated from the Western one, from the Eastern one. It was something on its own, and displaying some very peculiar features that informed heavily that the same modernity, the same today's world, and that have to be found in the distinction, especially of Germany from the other Western national monarchies, right? And that really conferred unique characteristics to the same. There are some different traditions also in material culture that at some point also blended in, especially towards the end, between Germany and Italy, that had somewhat been very different from the beginning. So as you know, what we call as the Kingdom of Germany and the Eastern Frankish Kingdom practically was the one evolving out of the Kingdom of Louis the German, which was itself created by the Carolingian Treaties of Verdun of 843 and of Mersenne in 870. So it would comprise, let's say, most of today's, let's say, Western German regions, the Netherlands, Eastern Belgium, Luxembourg, and large parts of the northeastern France as well. So it's a very, we're talking about properly the original one that is different from today's Germany as a whole. On the eastern frontier, there were the marks or marches of the Billungs, Nordmark, and Thuringia that were the eastern part of today's Germany fundamentally, and incorporated, however, within the empire only by the 12th century, right, as the Mark of Austria that was re-added, let's say, after the Ottonian victories over the Magyars. To the south, the Eastern Frankish Kingdom also included today's eastern Switzerland, the rest of modern Austria, much of Slovenia as well. So there is a southeastern frontier, especially that deserves, as we'll see now, attention as it remained floating more than the western one with France, that in a sense was blurred with by Lotharingia, the Flanders, that we include in today's video for this reason. And such frontiers would remain largely unchanged, apart from further eastern expansion, as you know, during the Ostsiedlung, in fact, of Pomerania, Polish Silesia, today's Polish Silesia, and temporarily also some Baltic regions, famously enough, as they were ruled by the Teutonic Knights in the 13th century. From the mid-12th century, however, the central authority of the emperor as Eastern Frankish king of Germany began to decline sharply from an institutional point of view. While it's true that exactly in the second half of the 12th century you have the peak of German power internationally and being essentially the strongest power in Europe, still the attempts of centralization of the empire were famously directed towards the Italic kingdom and later also the kingdom of Sicily. And this fundamentally prevented the German monarchy to centralize within its national boundaries that were not considered advantageous and for the purpose, let's say, and rightly so, frankly, because the opportunity of also reuniting East and West was through also the full Italian domination would have been much more remunerative than what then expanding in this many and quite warlike German principalities that were forming and expanding also autonomously, very often at the expense of the monarchy. So this is a bit evident even in the same mechanism that allowed the German kings at the time, for example, to launch the same offensives in the Italian peninsula as the northeastern German principalities were practically impossible to coerce in the effort. The same German defeat at Legnano against the Lombard League can be attributed in a sense to the lack of Saxon reinforcements by Henry the Lion. So in many ways we are talking about, as we'll see now, two areas of Germany, the western and the southern one that were traditionally the most advanced, the richest, the one that had been Romanized, also the most fertile, the best connected by international trade with the Rhine and the Danube. And this wilder, more savage and primitive, and quite also military tough as well, northeastern part that looked at other directions, mostly the Baltic, the Western Slavic world, and so on. And there are important differences, especially up to, let's say, towards the end, say, European warfare becomes so homogeneous that by the 14th century any kind of ethnic difference disappears, also with other countries in a way, within what properly becomes the West, and Germany being included at that point fully, also from a terms of technological point of view, also political institutional models, chivalry, feudalism, and so on, because it took a while before it occurred. But still so, and of course, this eventual collapse of the German monarchy, especially starting from the first half of the 13th century, had profound political as well as military consequences, part of which contributed to that same blend that we're talking about, but were just in the air and happened anyway. So, speaking of feudalism, in fact, the concept of knighthood had been slow to develop in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, right, dating from the late 11th and early 12th century. The reason being that the country was poorer, and traditionally the elites had less surplus, and this, on the other hand, brought to some kind of more egalitarian distribution in relative terms that still wouldn't actually produce much qualitative militias, for example, in the early phase, etc., and would make the situation also dramatically unstable, and so possible to centralize further, paradoxically, through feudalism, which could actually provide that gluing capacity as a factor. So that's something that would happen mostly in the western and southern regions of Germany. And in fact, it's not a surprise that aside from the Ottonians that rose in a condition of emergency because of an eastern threat, right, that was posed to the same Saxony together with Thuringia, together with Bavaria. The German monarchies of these times came from Franconia, from Swabia, right? And even though in the later times there is kind of beginning of shift towards the east, this mostly reflects the further feudalization of lands like Ulster that had been already part of that kind of wealthy group, let's say, but also of Bohemia that had been at that point fully integrated into the same German system, frankly, not much just in the empire per se, but being strongly Germanized in same military culture, and being a more unitary system, especially in the second half of the 13th century than Germany itself, and also kind of later on, and in fact rising to a dramatic power both in the times of Ottokar II and also the Luxembourgs at the end of our period. In Germany, in the early centuries, the associated term Ritter was not applied only to horsemen, right? It was just an idea of knighthood applying to the status of the individual. And as we will see, infantry in Germany would retain a greater relative importance than other lands, albeit again being of different nature from the one of other countries, and especially the ones that were pioneering infantry warfare. The general ban or levy of all the free vassals also survived longer in Germany than in France or England for this reason, right? Because an important bulk of the local stem duchies military forces could still derive through the mass of the peasantry. And this led to large but often ill-trained and inadequately armed forces, because there wasn't a broader system of supplying or uniform training or unity of command. But still, it would importantly dimension, in fact, the role between cavalry and infantry within the same German armies, accomplish also the nature of the land that at the beginning of this time was still largely covered in marshes, in forests, some of which had properly prevented the various stem duchies to unite politically into something more cohesive. And each land had its own language and traditions and even military styles in the early phase. Not dramatically different in nature, but still. And the military role of the peasantry, as we have said, was a feature, at least of some parts of Germany, long after he had been abandoned further west, right? Because the elite, being less affluent, couldn't quite control or coerce violently everyone, right? The idea is that it's not that the peasants were provided with particular higher personal freedom that elsewhere. This is a mistake that is often made. It's about the political fragmentation of the same nobility. That is to say, again, the capacity of centralization and having larger military assets, higher collective training, failed this region compared to, especially to France or England, that instead had kind of properly a much more concentrated power in the hands of fewer people, much larger estates, and albeit peasantry having been disarmed there, also having, however, important commoners' infantries that were also kind of politically organized in some fashion. In Germany, instead, traditionally, people were unfree from a juridical point of view. That is, if you were born there, you were most of the times simply somebody else's person, right? And the nobility, in this sense, had maintained not just a free hand of the peasants that were readily employable because they were the most typical individual that you could, functionally arm, but also an important autonomy from the same monarch, right? And this juridical state brought also to another distinctively German feature, that is the one of the Ministerialis that we talked about. Often there is a playlist also on them. That is to say, unfree serfs or unfree people that were serfs in origin that still served as cavalrymen, right? And stemming in a way from this system of peasant warriors, mostly depending on a lord. Naturally, there were some communities that were also free in the way we would intend, from at least practically from much heavier imposition. But this, as we will see, would be more a product of isolation, say, and again, a lack of means from the side of the local aristocracy, rather than a powerful force in absolute terms. And some of these areas were, again, particularly in the northeast, extremely primitive, right? And this would, at some point, allow the same peasantry to maintain more largely their own autonomy against some provincial nobility that lacked the means to tame them. While the emperor slash kings, depending on whether he was crowned in Rome or not, authority declined institutionally, which doesn't mean it declined in absolute terms. On the contrary, the German monarchs increased in personal power, and that's exactly the point, that while the public authority eroded, some of the most powerful imperial houses began to even negotiate, right, the loss of certain royal rights in exchange for the construction of private assets. And so that's what we talk about by the end of princely Germany, having all these powerful princely houses that began to monopolize also the institutional system of the German election and so on, but lacking an effective central power, even when they were elected individually to monarchy. So the military obligations of the feudal military elite, as we were saying before, depending on the reach of royal power, similarly decreased over time, right? Particularly those of the leading aristocracy that could basically manage their own lands as they pleased, and expanding their power at the expense of, very often also, of public authority. This is a complex system. I made many videos about medieval Germany, and so there is a playlist about that. You can check that out if you're interested. But it's the ABC of the German political institutional system as far as this video is concerned. The Ministerialis surely deserve some other word. As we were saying, these were basically serf knights. It was the national character of the German knighthood, and they had began as serfs, and that's what the term actually meant. It meant administrator, and these were free individuals who managed the land on behalf of their lords. And naturally, this, in a very warlike country like Germany, as you understand, the political instability being constant because of this situation, and also Germany not really having a defined eastern frontier, at least. So those areas, as we will see, would bring to some interesting developments, even for European arms and armor. But the same could be said in part from the same western frontiers, just that it was kind of one where the Germans would expand less because what they could get in terms of cost-benefit ratio. And the Ministerialis were quite advantageous because you could fundamentally entrust them some fiefs, and given that they were not freemen, they wouldn't have any right to their succession on the beneficium, and for this reason they could be and would be literally purchased, exchanged, resettled. The German nobility really used them widely in this regard, and given that they were, however, provided with these important autonomies, and they were traditionally non-freemen, they would actually be quite effective. They were really brutal men of war, and they turned fundamentally into the professional military, and especially in the armored hand of the royal authority, but also the ecclesiastical one. In fact, the largest contingents of Ministerialis are to be found under this very powerful and also, as you know, warlike German bishops that had adapted also to this state of affairs. And that, just like in other countries, traditionally, as clergymen backed the emperor, so that, for example, most of the troops that were sent in the Italian expeditions were ecclesiastical ministeriales. And the ministeriales acquired so much importance, especially in the ecclesiastical principalities and in southern Germany. So we're talking the most advanced areas where the nobility and the monarchy could actually engineer a better kind of military organization. It's calculated that, especially in the latter, in southern Germany between Swabia and Austria, by the mid 13th century or the early 13th century already, they made up 90% of the entire knightly force, being also quite faithful to the original masters. And the Ministerialis would fundamentally disappear in the political strife that followed after the interregnum and the establishment of the princely dynasties, as fundamentally their status had factually become identical to the one of other knights, well, actually even more powerful, even in some lords, as they still, as unfree servants, they could own tens of castles and having retinues on their own. And so at that point the difference was virtually insignificant, but it also reflected an important economic crisis that occurred, especially in the late 13th, early 14th century, where the princely houses affirmed kind of more direct control, even on the local prerogatives. And so many of them would also seek fortune abroad. Famously enough, in Italy they were employed en masse by the Italian communes. As you know, Scandinavia was factually almost taken over by the German mercenaries employed by the local kings, and also the Eastern expansion, the Baltic Crusades were an important valve, let's say, for venting this force. That was also a demographic force. Like Germany, at the beginning of the 14th century, reached the same level of the Italian population, for example. So it was a system in crisis, but it was demographically exploding, and so it was normal, a bit like the migration era, right? At some point, these young warlike individuals that had been nurtured also in a very kind of wild and unregulated and very often, in fact, extremely brutal context would sell their skills, their expertise abroad. And this is in fact also the moment in which the German knighthood and chivalric standards, in a sense, surpassed even the French one by a certain degree. There is a debate about this. I've personally been studying this closely, but still I have to carry out extensive research on this specific topic. But in many ways, the same Germans were owed by the French chivalry and their especially the French collective training, the quality of French knights. But as you know, with the defeat of Courtrai, that we'll also talk about now, speaking of the Flemish part of the German kingdom, had been significantly crippled, and very often the Germans, albeit being kind of more hotheads and less disciplined and arguably more individualistically oriented and thus less collectively not even trained but properly disciplined, that's the point, would be more performing, kind of the more regulated and better trained French, that however somewhat lost in kind of moral force and aggressiveness in a broader cultural sense. At this point, of course, there's a huge, negative bias towards the French cavalry during the 14th century, the 15th century. Actually, that remained the top, right, in Europe in many ways. Right, it's just that there are these important moral dimensions that are often not measured, and that are not just a matter of single events happening somewhere that are not. However, fully compared to other realities. So not even the French defeats of the 14th, the early 15th century, actually account necessarily for an alleged, loss in effectiveness or incapacity of the French cavalry that was obsolete or that were making poor tactical choices. It's all being made up for fitting a specific narrative that today we cannot digress on, but that I will be more explicit in another video. In any case, Germany scores this hit because it was also now a fully feudalized, in this sense, a fully westernized system that was deeply soaked into this kind of chivalric mode, and because of its private nature, right, of political culture, it still, served perfectly the chivalric ethos and lifestyle, because yes, this was a pretty tormented land, as you know, fragmented in hundreds of principalities, so in which if you didn't know how to fight, fundamentally there was and from a largely feudal background, because as we will see now, there were important town leagues and things like this with some important militias and even infantry strength by the 13th century, but the country was still overwhelmingly feudal and still quite pretty invariably so at that point. And remember always that there is a refeudalization of warfare all over Europe in the late Middle Ages. Right, there is no such thing like the rise of the commoners or anything that you've been told often, thinking of the Renaissance as some kind of humanistic value. It's the complete opposite, right? The people were brought ever more under, and that's exactly the moment in which the Ancien regime crystallized at the expense of the lower classes that had lost, by the way, on the battlefield. So it was also it's not necessarily that we're talking about deserving that, but still they had a chance and they spoiled it. In any case, as in England and France, mercenaries came to play an increasingly important role in the German kingdom, especially in the late 12th and 13th centuries. Right, these were some of the most tumultuous moments of growth of Europe, and Germany, together with England, were some of the fastest growing countries, right, in relative terms, right. Southwestern Europe was by far richer, more advanced, but in comparison, countries like this rose faster, right, much faster, so that by the end of the Middle Ages they also reached important levels of parity. Like by the 15th century, Germany and Italy were the most technologically advanced countries in Europe, for example. And so Germany there filled dramatically a gap that had existed, historically in the millennia, in a very rapid time. So most of these mercenaries were interestingly recruited from within the empire itself, right? Particularly from Brabant, the Netherlands, or neighboring Flanders. These areas had, as we will see now, been, in many ways they were diverse. There were some areas like, Frisia, that was dramatically one of the most depressed areas in Europe, and instead Flanders was one of the richest places in Europe, and not very far away, frankly, from each other. So the background was mixed, but the general idea is that these lands that had originally belonged to what we call as Lotharingia, so this area that fundamentally stretched from the Alps here a bit to south, considering Brabant, Netherlands, Flanders, etc., but let's say towards the North Sea, that were again a mix, let's say, in fact, between French and German characters in some way. They were decentralized, right? Lotharingia didn't evolve like other post-Carolingian regions into a polity of some, let's say, of some cohesion. It remained largely autonomous, without an actual center of power, with powerful nobiliar houses that fundamentally hegemonized their own surroundings. And in some islands, this important instead towns that grew dramatically in wealth and also military potential, especially in Flanders. That the county of Flanders was in part. Flanders was actually straddled both the empire and France. Right, so it was still, however, the centralized land. For this reason, also flourished and managed somewhat to to undermine feudal administration there. And I made videos about medieval Flanders, medieval Flemish warfare, medieval Flemish tactics. So there's a playlist about that too. You can check that out if you are interested better. But these areas were growing as well from a demographic point of view. And so, let's say the surplus, the exceeding, the systemic excess was embodied by these very interesting units of mercenary infantry, right, that characterize a bit the 12th century. Also think about the Brabançons that were called like this, this essentially scumbags that raided the wall. Brabançon is just a synecdoche. They didn't necessarily have to come from Brabant. But I made a video about them, and as you know, they created in the moment also of the greatest spread of heresy, to this kind of unrest, to this in fact anti-knightly mindset for which the infantry, was used. So these outcasts, in a way, that raided the countryside and tried to trigger a revolution, even by some degree. But in their homeland, they, of course, were kind of more concentrated and producing fine militias that were integrated with still the locally dominating cavalry. And this is quite interesting because the areas of Brabant, especially, also part of Flanders initially, even the Netherlands, were still feudal areas, right? And so the noblemen ruled, and also from some of the most chivalric and kind of feudal mindsets that you can imagine, but still integrating infantry, which normally by the local historiography was not considered particularly, and so probably is obscured also for our historical understanding of the local warfare, but that figured prominently, and that also exactly because they were kind of considered inferior, still obtained remarkable results in the field, also against heavy cavalry. That would culminate essentially in the Battle of the Golden Spurs at Courtrai in 1302, where the flower French cavalry was massacred by the militias of Brugge and Ghent. That is much more of an exception than you think. Always about that. Never buy the garbage of the infantry revolution that never existed historically, nor the fact that these victories set any, it was a happy ending with everybody living independent and free. No, they lost in the end. And not just that, but they basically lost every single battle up to the end of the Middle Ages, exactly against essentially French model heavy cavalry, either the French or the Burgundians, but it's basically the same thing, until the Battle of Guinegate, where Maximilian of Habsburg at least tried to emulate the Swiss by imposing, say, their model on Flanders. That still, partially succeeded in that draw that Guinegate was, but also wouldn't devil because the Habsburgs didn't have force to impose it on the longer run as a military system, and they rather created the Landsknechten. In any case, that's another story, but I made a video about that as well because it's remarkable as much as the narratives that and the mythologies that are formed around these things really are. But the Brabant infantry was important. It was pikemen, right? Pikemen were not a Renaissance thing; that had always existed. It's just having somebody who can use it en masse effectively, was determined, drilled, etc. And these troops were. And they, before Courtrai, they had the Flemish had all a set of experiments, let's say, some of which succeeded properly against knights, right? And the last stand of the Brabançons at Bouvines on the Anglo-German right, after that their army had been wiped out by the French, is it's the proof of how hard this men could be. Right, they had to be surrounded by the French, and still they fought to the death, and taking down lots of enemies in the process. So there was something there, properly spreading, not just as it was not really a matter of technique, right? We see some weapons that are very interestingly developing in the area, like we see foot soldiers armed with spears, hooked pikes, and other interesting weapons. The same good and that later on. There is also a bit of a mysterious weapon and not necessarily what we see actually on iconographic evidence, but this played a very important tactical role even in the early 13th century, as we've seen, and they witness, again, a material adaptation, but to what was essentially a moral effort that was pretty astonishing at the time. The victories, for example, of the Lombards over the German emperors, and these stories like Attigliano or Cortenuova, of Italian infantry facing alone, right, why abandoned by their own cavalry, sometimes even for an entire day, the charges of heavy imperial heavy cavalry, right, and holding their ground was something, beyond belief, and it definitely contributed, also in these areas of Europe, to develop the idea that the heavy cavalry and the feudal elite and political and social system could be challenged on the battlefields, and successfully, right? And the Flemish are the first ones that actually make it, right, where a solely infantry army manages to defeat the best army in Europe at the time, the French one. So it's about the self-confidence of these communities that had been habituated to be autonomous in a way, that lived in a decentralized position, that could exploit even partly the crisis of the feudal states, and so on. But at least in this northern European area, it wouldn't actually evolve into a sounder infantry tradition. There is an interesting aspect about German warfare at this time that may be connected, at least according to some, to such infantry development that is to be witnessed even in other areas, not just in Northwest, also in the rest of Germany. Think about the Battle of Wöhringen in 1288, etc. So we are also in similar years. There's our years in which a bit in Western Europe you do see a pretty shared infantry development, a pretty fast ones, right? So in different areas of Europe, there were different balances, and so this also a bit fakes our own perspective to understand really who in absolute term had really the best infantry in a way. But in Germany, as we've seen, was not really one of those lands. But still, again, in the West and in the South, this infantry is to be felt in battles, and with important, not just melee capacity, but also the development of crossbows. So there is an aspect, plate armor developed in Europe for the first time in Germany, and especially in the eastern part, right? The one in the Slavic frontier that at the time, however, was actually rather the one with the Mongols that also entered Germany along the borders and threatened also the invasion. The German-Polish effort at Lenitsa was annihilated, was thwarted by the Mongols that caused probably the extermination of the army. And so it's been believed that the development of plate armor in Germany, and especially the fact that the first specimens are to be found all on the eastern frontier, on the Elbe, on other areas towards the ones at the boundary with the Mongols, that this might have developed because of the increased firepower that the Mongols had brought with their horse archery in the field. Now, this hypothesis is very seducing because otherwise there wouldn't be any particular reason why Eastern Germany should have had this chronological record. And by the way, Europe essentially adopted plate armor in a few years homogeneously everywhere. So that means that the change was just in the air. It just had to begin first somewhere, apparently, from an archaeological point of view. But at this point, European arms and armor become completely identical everywhere. And so this was a change. It was triggered by conditions that were present all over the continent. It wasn't about, discovering plate armor. Plate armor already existed. We find it even, and maybe making this point, for example, in the 12th century, there's a Byzantine chronicler that says that Hungarian knights had this. And it's possible that this eastern area kind of was more in contact with the horse archers of the steppes, etc., had developed this thing further. And Polish cavalry that at this point was being Germanized, and especially in areas like Silesia in the northwest of the country, was practically identical to the German one, and while the southeastern one was kind of more steppe-like, already showed some, albeit organic, form of plate armor that also basically ran around the abdomen to close in the back, right? So this type of armor has been said, was already in the air around, and probably the Germans developed it further in metal. The Germans at this time had fundamentally fully adopted fully gapped any distance with Western military technology. So it would be kind of natural to develop in that sense. And naturally, we just rely on archaeological evidence, which is incomplete and everything, so it's not like a proof. But the question is, why would it happen there? And yes, it's possible. It's possible that, especially the need of this need of covering. You see, plate armor can be just a big, chest plate or something else. Like even horses had normally on the chest, on the head, when this developed further also for them. And he said, no, this is full horse plate armor, something very late, and plate armor in the first place was also something extremely rare altogether. Even when plate armor was around. But I mean, for the horsemen, this started from properly enclosing the abdomen, right? Some of the most and the earliest evidences, for example, St. Maurice statue at the Dome of Magdeburg. If you visit, it's beautiful, and it shows exactly as it is. And this covers essentially the sides and the back. And considering the tactics that the Mongols had employed against the German Polish knights that basically were lured into this trap by the Mongols refusing the center and then enveloping them on the wings, you understand that the risk of, say, having projectiles coming from everywhere, also from the back and the side, increased dramatically. And naturally, this could have happened in the same way, fighting against infantry, maybe remaining isolated while increasing this higher protection, etc. But for increasing again that specific area of Central Europe to eventually spread immediately everywhere, the explanation could fit that, right? If the threat came from crossbow, because you see, Western warfare was essentially frontal, right? There weren't enveloping maneuvers. Yes, there were flank attacks, but they were carried out by a handful of soldiers were just aimed to surgically cut the enemy formation in through, and not targeting with an increased missile power or just being more offensive altogether from the side, representing this material threat to some parts of your on your rear, etc. So this, let's say, ever more dangerous battlefield that is becoming so also in the West, especially because of the rise of the infantry, but probably also this kind of bit Eastern bias is very strongly coming in Germany, right? Again, the steppes arguably end in Germany. German warfare witnesses the steppes dracones used as battle standards, in up to the 13th century. So, as we were saying before, this idea that Germany doesn't really have an eastern frontier, and it's always open to this waves also of people. Still, the Cumans were around. The same Hungary, in a way, was a hub for those steppes peoples to centralize and torment also the eastern frontier of Germany, etc., may bring to this innovation. Right, German emperors were quite active, also countering the Mongol threat, or at least predisposing in that sense. And so this is quite interesting, in my opinion. It could be an explanation for that. What I wanted to point out also is that in the previous centuries, let's say the 11th, the 12th, we do see a lot of, let's say, of exposure also from Eastern influence. For example, in Ottonian times, you still have, even in the manuscripts, famously enough, the Codex Aureus of Echternach, for example. There's a lot of Byzantine influence there. There was still a lot of military technology literally coming to Central Europe, also through this context between Constantinople, Scandinavia, France, England, Italy. Germany was just in between, and so it would receive this important kind of also stepwise at some point. It would maintain for a longer time. Still, however, for the aforementioned reason, so a bit less stratified society and kind of very difficult ground, German knights often fought dismounted. As we've seen, infantry was important, but it was important also because knights dismounted more frequently. And you find, in fact, up to the mid-12th century, that is the moment in which we see properly French feudalism is imported by Frederick Barbarossa to develop further properly the country to that feudal land, political and institutionally. You have many battles fought, let's say, by deploying knights dismounted, protected by some natural obstacles like rivers and on hilltops and so on. So it was very common in many ways. Also, again, cavalry had a rough time in all those forests and marshes and so on. So that would go on for a longer time. In fact, we see in some areas that the mail slits on the lower part of the body armor, while local technology was already very advanced metallurgically, still maintained the lateral position, not the frontal one. That means that the frontal one was more suited for being on horseback, because you have the slit in the front opening with the legs, and so it was easier to ride a horse like that. Instead, in some areas of Germany, you see this slits remaining on the sides, suggesting that infantry warfare was something more normal even for knights. And in fact, there is an even more archaic reference that you can find, for example, in the employ of Swabian mercenaries at the Battle of Civitate in 1059 in the papal army against the Normans that were mounted. Instead, these guys were apparently just infantry and fighting with large swords. You know that double-hand swords do not come around normally until the last decades of the very last decades of the 13th century, and even there, all Europe basically gets them, right? So these were probably 1.5 hand swords that, by the way, differently from double hands one, you can use on horseback as well. And the idea is that, given that there are references also later on, even in French literature, to the so-called Grand Épée d'Allemagne, so the big swords of Germany, there's this idea that swords were kind of more functionalized in Germany for foot combat, even possibly in a sort of not really anti-cavalry per se, because against cavalry you just use practically a pike to stop a cavalry charge, but it's a bit like the Saxons at Hastings. The idea, you see that on foot, that when cavalry stopped, they would even smash their axes, chopping a horse's skull, not very practically, but still in the heat of battle productively, and given that it was also about smashing armor, and so the guys who were on the horses, that kind of makes sense in a way, and infantry did that, because it also, when cavalry does charge into infantry, it does it like hell. At some point it stops, and that's the dangerous moment, and where the foot soldier has his shot. And that's apparently the reason why the Germans had this kind of probably larger swords, or at least they were famous for this reason. It was also an almost ethno-racialistic bias already at the time, for which the youth of Germany was praised because they were tall and strong and so brutally violent and so on. During the Crusades, they were looked at the fact that they were, in fact, less modern, less secularized, even in mindset. They were just more like warriors than the knights at some level. But the idea even in there that this would have happened allegedly because the Germans were taller, and by how much, a few inches, than other peoples. And by the way, that doesn't hold, because Scandinavians didn't have apparently larger swords even than the Germans in that sense, because they were taller. Doesn't make any sense. This has to do properly and probably with this more kind of properly infantry, let's say better, non-cavalry suited terrain of Germany, right? Some of you will say, but the Scandinavians had the Danish axe. Well, the Danish axe was used there because they mostly fought on foot as well, right? And they had to smash against equally, heavily armored guys on a close range that, if you fight on horseback, you just can't do. You will just use a spear to pierce the enemy by exploiting the speed. So the idea of size, because these people were taller, is doesn't make the weapon, right? Large people have large weapon. This is true. That's why there is no such a thing like the longbow, because the type of bow is exactly identical to any other bow that has ever been produced all over Western Europe since ever. It's just if the guy is taller, there will be a longer bow, and if the guy is shorter, will be a shorter bow, and that's pretty much it. But again, you don't see, say, larger swords in other areas where people were tall just because. It probably has to do with this kind of spread, actually, of knighthood and of chivalry and of also feudal technology in this still wild country of Germany that still necessitated maybe to put a bit more emphasis on the infantry weapons and not on cavalry per se. So for us to say, okay, look, these have larger swords, because on average they would fight more likely on foot, and they would maybe need this sword to be a bit more versatile and maybe even more performing at parity of human being, frankly. So that before cavalry fully developed in a way that could be, politics would concentrate it more effectively, and so to surpass even the terrain difficulties, because the terrain difficulties are not decisive in a military culture, just can influence a little bit, but not by the majority or anything. So that's how it is surpassed, and so we don't have this kind of giantism in later eras based on nationality. No. So that's probably the explanation. So as we were saying before, rural militias were another feature of some parts of Germany, but more directly associated with the continuing role of infantry was the growing importance of German towns, especially the Freie Reichsstadt that could boast this fil rouge with the emperor himself, that would become such strategic centers and a source of men and money. Especially the German urban militias soon became well armed, right? Their effectiveness is indicated mostly, again, in the northwest part of the kingdom. As we were saying before, mostly the Flemish defeated the French at Courtrai, but also not really scoring basically any other full success later on. There are other areas actually more like peasantry, like Frisia. We'll see Switzerland in part. It was kind of a hybrid between mountaineers and townsmen in a sense, that scored actually more successes against cavalry per se. The the German towns had this aspect that they could form leagues that would become very important, such as in the case of the Swiss Confederacy, but there is also the Rhine League, the Swabian League, etc. The only point is that the city in Germany doesn't actually rule over the surrounding countryside. It's just an important trade center. It can be very rich and can equip well its men, but it doesn't have this expansive capacity to form, let's say, properly a city-state on its own. And there are instances, like in the case of Cologne, the largest and most important city of Germany, where the burghers managed to expel the archbishop, right? The most important ecclesiastical prince, elector in the country. But fundamentally, what you have as a consequence is Cologne, and then surrounded by a gigantic episcopal state in all the surrounding countryside. So in which the burghers do not expand. It's what you see on German battlefields is really a mix when you see the effectiveness of infantry of peasant forces, right, rural militias, and town forces combined, right, and they all used them because these towns also were not just the free imperial ones, but they were also under other lords, right. In a way, say, I don't know. Also, the Hanseatic cities were, albeit very independent. And independent-minded, but formally still under the noblemen of the noble houses of the hinterland, right? Because it was convenient in a way, having all these connections, and as long as they were not oppressive, why not? And for example, the German Dittmarscher were able defeating the Count of Holstein by exploiting excellently the terrain, not allowing the enemy troops to deploy effectively with marshes on the sides, and bottling them up, cutting them to pieces. So that's blind fury, right? But they exploit well their land. Also, the enemy is not dramatically powerful, and they manage to retain their autonomy for some generations, but remaining isolated. More in the sense for the rich town that is in the center of many powerful principalities, it's a bit a different story, right? And that's why there is no such actual prevalence of infantry in Germany, and all the German infantry victories are in peripheral areas, such as again the German Dittmarsch, Dittmarsch and the Flanders, that is not even Germany, technically from a national point of view, Switzerland, right? In the East, you don't have practically anything of this because it's a much more feudal reality, and also towns are less powerful, right? So it's a bit the same reason. Equally, the Swiss dramatically exploit the terrain, but the early 14th century Swiss infantry victories have properly nothing to do with the mid-15th century Swiss military development. That is a completely different thing on a completely different basis. And the early Swiss victories are not, in the sense, this great much compared to others that were happening, like the Scottish ones or the Flemish ones, etc., in other areas of Europe, or even within the same Germany. In any case, there was an important spread of gunpowder artillery in Germany, as the local organization, the care also for the military supplies, especially in the cities, and so in these centers that were quite proud of their own autonomies, had a remarkable military relevance. For example, Metz, Aachen, Deventer, Soest, Frankfurt am Main, Köln, Cologne, as well as neighboring cities just inside French-ruled Flanders, were soon and well equipped with artillery. The Flemish essentially changed their armies throughout the 14th to 15th century just by adding some important amount of artillery that, however, didn't really prevent them from being constantly defeated, at that point. So, as always, technology is nothing, doctrine is everything. And all these early references to firearms stem unsurprisingly from the Rhineland, the Meuse basin, or neighboring provinces. In fact, what the Flanders and Lorraine would be famous for in the Burgundian state that still factually conquered them, was for producing town militias and artillery, albeit they didn't have much of a per se kind of individually functional military like, say, the Dukes of Burgundy had, right? And the latter would just integrate these ones, also with great difficulties, because militias do not really serve as professional troops, but in some cases successfully, right, in their own armies. And there are even earlier references in areas that actually are not even German, but they were historically in contact with Germany pretty much. That is Friuli in northeastern Italy, that was constantly involved with the events of Carinthia. There was a kind of Italian, German, Slavic frontier there. It was always very permeable. The same Habsburgs later on kind of interfered in there. It was normal to have contingents of various nationalities. Produce this early reference of firearms. Naturally, yes, areas like Italy made an important use of artillery quite early on. But the point, as we've seen also in other videos, for example, last year about the Scottish army organization in the 14th, 15th centuries, is not much. Again, this idea that a country invents the thing and the others copy that or get it from it. These technologies were everywhere, equally, in the same measure. The difference that was made was, again, how many assets and or need your local powers have to equip themselves of these firearms, right? And so it's also sometimes a matter of documentation more easily, because I've witnessed it many times. Even smaller centers actually seem to make an earlier use, for example, of mercenaries, but the same artillery, firearms, or maybe they produce them to sell them, right? So this makes you realize that even countries that were not particularly updated technologically at the time still, produced, of course, these weapons like easily. Where it's not even producing artillery, it actually doesn't cost much at all. It's more like gunpowder that costs a lot. It's difficult to find, to produce. But it's spread everywhere, right? Just some areas are much better documented, and therefore you can't say, oh, look, here's plenty of them. But you don't have to think in this sense that, it's likely also because they produce more of it. There is no doubt, and maybe even the best of it, because that's what we see, that more advanced places produce also better technology. But this doesn't mean that, I don't know, the Brandenburg little nobleman that had heard of this stuff and ruled over a couple of castles didn't want to have his own firearm, right, ready to use in some of his skirmishes against the Pomeranians or whoever. And so that's actually more common than it seems. And so one shouldn't even say, it's the first time that we witnessed this. Well, you don't really know, because we don't have such a level of documentation to presume that, since there's a first evidence of something, that place is is the top, or is the place where it first spread. No, likely it wasn't. Right. So there was naturally a great variation between the military systems of different parts of the Kingdom of Germany. They may seem to a novice, to a neophyte, irrelevant, but in relative terms, they actually were, because also the Kingdom of Germany was huge extensionally, right? So it's been a reason for which it had been so difficult to control in the first place. All these noblemen had their own retinues. Even the clergy was militarized. The Abbey of Fulda had up to 20,000 men allegedly under his command. And there were mercenaries also from other places, right? The western regions, as we've seen, were highly urbanized, while others were more primitive. And we witnessed the survival of infantry forces mainly in areas like the Swiss mountains, the Frisian islands, the Dithmarschen marshes, and among the eastern Weser river settlements. As we've seen, the latter speak rather of isolation than development of infantry militias, urban militias. So again, it's moral force, and also against other moral force of different degree that makes this thing happening, militarily speaking. It's not necessarily greater development in absolute terms. The emergence of crossbow armed mounted infantry is witnessed in some parts of southern Germany, especially the eastern one. And this is true, especially during the, say, mounted crossbowmen. I made a video about them recently, specifically as the historical military unit, exactly in the 12th century. Were present pretty much everywhere, right? Mounted bowmen were much more common in Western Europe than we think. It's just that in southeastern Germany, it seems there to be a cradle of some sort of, or hub of some sort of mounted bowmen, and especially crossbowmen. The interesting aspect is that if you look, for example, at German or Italian sources of the early 14th century, you notice that there were lots of Germans in Italy. And normally, none of the sources states that there were mounted crossbowmen. The only areas where these are witnessed are in northeastern Italy and in southeastern Germany, that are exactly this area of frontier towards Hungary, right? And so some broader also Eastern or even Balkan influence that, as you know, was importantly characterized by mounted archery. By some degree, the Hungarians had settled the Kumans that you still find fighting next to the Germans. For example, the Battle of Markfeld, together with the Hungarians against the Bohemians. So you have some complex there, and you realize that, say, the Carinthians made extensive use of these mounted crossbowmen that weren't actually there. They were like coming from other areas. From the areas of the Banate, in fact, this is something I have researched personally as well, and that appears in the sources, that area probably had combined the crossbow technology was kind of more practically widespread in the West, and mounted archery of steppes influence, and so having this higher amount of properly mounted crossbowmen in that specific area. And yes, it is an Eastern influence. It's not a matter of speculation. But it's really Eastern because, for example, when you look at other military styles, such as the one of the Slavs, that are present in the area as well as on the Eastern German frontier, think about Silesia, think about even, beyond with the Teutonic state, etc. Well, when you look even at traditional Slavic settlements in what were the duchies of Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola that had been Germanized in the High Middle Ages, you see that the Slavs have a markedly Western and fundamentally identical military style to the one of the German provinces. This is something you see also in Hungarian warfare. I made a video about that. Showing how archaeologically, yes, the Slavs that inhabited around the Pannonian Plain mostly were, especially the ones in the north, the one in the south were more kind of influenced by other models. But let's say the Slovakians or the Moravians and also other Slavs living properly within other German lands now were, since a pretty old time, Frankish influence. Their equipment was not one, let's say, influenced by the steppe or the Byzantines or whatever. They were Westerns as well. So that's an important indicator of the Western technological spread towards the East that the Germans carried out themselves. And the the German metallurgic production was important. Germany at this time doesn't have like industrial centers, like for example the ones that existed in Lombardy that were objectively the most advanced, even just properly from a business model, other than just technologically or kind of organizationally. But they had an important metallurgical tradition, and they exported a relevant amount of weapons in the Western Slavic world as well. And what is fascinating is also from an early age, like if you study the 11th to 12th century, but also before, you realize that there were, say, archaeologically axe heads in, say, Poland that we know were made in Germany, but that the Germans didn't use in Germany, which means that the Germans were producing weapons on the, as catering weapons properly on request of foreign markets that had a specific military style on their own, and that the Germans were producing weapons for in that fashion, right? And this is extraordinary because it tells you the level of entanglement that existed in Central Europe, right, between Germans, Bohemians, Poles, etc., and even beyond. And generally speaking, when you look at the Baltic, for example, and this is even for the Scandinavian countries, you realize that the Germans exported like crazy there, because the top, right, the West there were the Germans, and so the local cultures, especially in the Baltic countries, I mean the ones in continental side, the Baltic peoples, were just getting from them. Albeit, of course, they had also some Eastern influence from other powers around. But the Teutonic Knights especially were in a sense the best Europe could offer in terms of military equality, and probably as a model also as a state that was also very different from what existed in Germany, or better, it did not exist in Germany. And so it's complicated in a way, but it's once you get the main references, it's kind of easy to understand. And yeah, I mean, it's just this chat about the main features of German warfare at the time, nothing really too in-depth per se, but again, we will look at all this step by step. I realized dreadfully, here I inserted some pictures also from the late Ottonian period. It's not, okay, I started from collecting pictures from the year 1000, not 1050 as in the date. But we never made a video about Ottonian warfare in detail. What the hell? Like, and this is partly because I do things randomly and I want to cover everything. And so we just were unlucky that we didn't talk about this yet. However, we'll keep talking about medieval German warfare beyond the same. We'll cover all the other countries, hopefully. And for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.